depend on the PO, I guess.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right. So it is 3 o'clock. Can we have the judges unmute themselves really quickly or make their video accessible? All right, there we go. There we go. All right, so just a few reminders from Tab Room. Can you please make sure that the POs are considered for the ballot, and also double check that no double ranks are submitted after the round. Additionally, all ballots must be submitted within 30 minutes of the round's completion. That's just coming directly from Tab Room. Also, the PO should get 2 scores, 1 for each hour of debate. All right, so with that being said, do we have any like PO people who are willing to run in the PO nomination?
I nominate Representative Winder.
Okay.
I humbly accept.
Motion.
Yep.
Motion to close the floor for PO nominations.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any
Second.
opposed? All right, Mr. Winder, you are our PO for this session.
Hi, that's Representative Winder, the INDER, your presiding officer this session. Before we actually move into our first order of business, I want to see how you all would like to vote when we vote on pieces of legislation and vote on different motions. There is a voting feature. If you look in the section on the right side of your screen, there's a yes and no, or we can vote with our placards. Would you rather do that or vote with our placards?
Placard.
Placard.
Placards work for
The
me.
placard, yeah.
Okay. We're gonna have to make sure, hold the placards up so you can see them, see you're holding them up visibly when we're voting on different items. For time signals, I have a couple of different options, and I also want that to be kind of how the chamber wants to. So I can do at 2 minutes, I can do 1, at 2:30, I can do 2, at 2:55, I can do 3, and then at 3:03, I would gavel you down. I feel like this kind of simulates our standard gaveling procedure that we usually use on the national circuit. But if anybody else has any other suggestions or preferences, you can go ahead and make those made now. Does that sound good to everybody?
Oftentimes we use a signal like this to indicate. I don't know, that might be
Indicates the
helpful.
gavel down, like for gavel down.
Yes.
Yeah. Since
Okay, then at 3:03, when I gavel you down, I'll use this. Is that good?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Does anybody have any other questions about my procedure?
No, just a
Fantastic.
point of
So,
inquiry. Sorry,
Yes,
I've been having trouble getting my internet connected, so I wanted to make sure everyone can hear me. Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
I can hear you just fine. All right, perfect.
Thank
With that
you.
being said, and before we start, I just want to check with the parliamentarian that we end. Is it a hard stop at 5:30 Eastern time?
Yes, hard stop at 5:30.
All right, good. Let's get started at 2:03. I hereby call this legislative
Wait,
session into
Ms.
order. Is there a
Martinez,
motion?
question?
Is there a motion? Representative Martinez,
Motion, move to open the floor for docket nominations.
is there a second?
Second.
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 All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Assuming unanimous consent, are there any nominations?
Motion.
Representative Farage,
I move to nominate the first docket, which is just ABC, would be free lunches, UNCRC, and then social media.
Motion.
is there a second?
Second.
Representative Mengele,
to close the floor for docket nominations.
Second.
Second.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed? Assuming unanimous consent, we will now move on to debate on the first item regarding free lunches. Since there are no authorship privileges for this tournament, we'll now see the first sponsor of this bill. Please raise your placard. Sponsors, first affirmative. Representative Valles, I did see you first.
Thank you. That's Representative Vyas, spelled V-Y-A-S for the judges. I don't think there's a school code, so just any indication if this audio level is correct, and I'll gladly begin. There is a point of inquiry in the chat. I don't know if you want to address that before or after my speech.
Mr. Baran,
So point of inquiry as to how you're picking speakers. You said you picked Mr. Vyas because he raised his you saw him first, but shouldn't you wait, or can you wait, I should say, until everyone raises their placards, then pick randomly from that, so it's not like a speed competition?
I can do that for sure. Mr. Vyas raised his placard like probably 3 or 4 seconds before Mr. Gardiner did, but to make sure that this isn't like a sport or anything, just make it completely random.
Oh, because also Ms. Martinez, I thought, raised her placard too.
Okay, yeah, we'll wait about 5 seconds after I call in case there are any video lagging or anything like that. I think that could play a role in it too, to make sure that everybody has an opportunity for me to see it.
All right, cool. Once again, I'll ask if the judges are ready, just any indication. Perfect, perfect, perfect.
Question. Wait, Miss Martinez, do you still have a point of inquiry? Because it hasn't been used.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for the delay, but I was just curious when you asked if we had any questions. For our questioning blocks, will you give us any time signals to let us know our time is going to elapse?
Yeah, so like just any other direct questioning block on the national circuit, I'll do this at there's usually like one gap, and then I'll automatically move to the next question.
Thank you. I'm so
Does
sorry.
that sound to everybody?
I'm really, really sorry. My internet just like completely lagged out and I missed the entire thing. Could you repeat that? I'm really sorry.
Okay, so at 20 seconds, you'll get a 10 like this. Just like on the national circuit, you get one gavel at 20 seconds in the direct questioning period. Now let's let Mr. Bias speak, please.
All right, I know you all are ready, so I'll get going. During the 2016 campaign trail, President Trump made it very clear that a focus of his campaign was going to be repealing a lot of Obama-era policies. What we didn't end up realizing until January of this year is that when President Trump said he was going to repeal Obama-era policies, that actually extended to previous First Lady Michelle Obama. On her birthday this year, President Trump rolled back one of the defining parts of Michelle Obama's legacy, the fact that children in schools were able to now eat healthy. I stand in affirmation of today's legislation to make sure that the well-being of our children is not a political pawn, but rather a priority. Affirm. First, let's understand what the problem with school lunches in the status quo, and then we'll understand how today's legislation actually solves that problem. First, the problem in the status quo is that lunch debt in America perpetuates the great divide between haves and have-nots in the status quo. The first part of this problem is quite simply children in the status quo are unable to afford school lunches. Thousands of our constituents live paycheck to paycheck, and a $2 school lunch might not sound like much, but when a car accident sets you back and forces you to turn to loan sharks, a $2 school lunch 5 days a week is detrimental to actually being able to afford basic human services. But the problem in the status quo actually extends much further than that, because not being able to afford school lunch is only part of the problem. The Washington Post reports in December of 2019 that a result of people not being able to afford school lunch has actually turned into something called lunch shaming. Essentially, lunch shaming is when students unable to afford lunch have to either wear wristbands indicating they can't afford lunch, clean the lunchroom, or even help the lunch staff throw away uneaten food. They say that education is the great equalizer. But when school lunches quite literally divide our students between having money and having no money, change is needed. But let's understand what today's legislation does to make sure that isn't an issue. And the solution is a clear policy to not allow any government red line or any red tape to actually get in the way of educating and feeding our children. That same Washington Post article tells us that the main reason a universal school lunch wasn't adopted in the first place is that fiscally conservative board members wanted to teach our students about economics. Instead of actually teaching our students economics in the classroom, they starved our children in order to ensure that all students, at the very least, attend high school and have, or any sort of school and have a safe meal. I stand in affirmation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 10 seconds. All questioners, please raise your placard now. Representative Saxena and Representative Mangalik.
There's 4.
Hi, Representative. Should I?
Followed by Representative Baron and Representative Joel.
Right. Hi, Representative. So do we have a free and reduced lunch program in the status quo?
Yes, but if it was, I believe that taking it to a universal standard is much better.
Okay, but if we're already allowing the kids that need a free and reduced lunch, like your example with like those who can't afford it, then why do we need to extend this program to those who don't?
Right, I'd say that the current program is inadequate, and we're like, in order to reform the current program,
But
we're
why
going
is
to have to raise the threshold to a point
is it-
where it just, sorry?
Why is it inadequate?
Mangalik.
Hi, Representative. So there's clearly a problem with the existing national school lunch program if people who can't afford lunches aren't getting them. But why don't we just raise the threshold for when you get free or reduced lunches instead of literally giving and spending our limited resources on kids who can very well afford lunches?
Right, because like when you have to like, there comes a point in the threat, like where the threshold doesn't make much sense, right? Because even if you raise it so that
Okay, so bouncing off that question, if we have this threshold and we already have programs within the states, doesn't it just make more sense to give more money to the states instead of universalizing this whole program?
No, once again, I'd say it makes more sense to establish a universal free lunch because it doesn't become a burden on anyone to afford school lunch.
But it becomes a burden on us. It becomes a burden on the states to now transport
Right,
this
I
food from
believe
all
it's our
across the country.
priority and like our duty as a United States Congress
Joel.
to feed our children.
Students shouldn't be stigmatized because of lunch debt, correct?
Absolutely.
Then why shouldn't we pass stop lunch shaming laws like California, Oregon, Hawaii have instead of passing
Right.
a law that raises taxes on Americans?
Lunch shaming is a result of people not being able to afford lunch. That's
So
what
why
this
can't we pass a law that says you can't lunch shame students that wouldn't have to universalize a program?
Right, passing a law saying
Thank
like,
you. Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as that was a sponsorship
Okay,
speech,
can we
the
pause?
chair is now.
So I just want to intervene real quick. So just to like echo what has already been said in the chat, if we can have the observers please leave the room and access this via YouTube so there's less lag. We are having a problem with one of our representatives not being able to access the like audio and video of this like performance. So if you could please do that, that'd be lovely.
And is that all we have from there?
Yeah, all good. Continue.
All right, seeing as there was a sponsorship speech, the chair is now seeking a negative speaker to please rise. Representative Wu.
Sorry, I was on mute. This is Representative Wu, spelled W-U, hailing from the snowy state still of Illinois. And just an indication when you guys are ready would be wonderful. All judges? Great. Let's remember about the story of Robin Hood, the joyous hero who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. But today's legislation is the exact opposite of Robin Hood. What we do is we steal from the poor and we give to the rich. And that's why I stand on firm negation of today's legislation. Representative Vias pointed out issues within the status quo, but what he fails to explain is the economics behind what today's legislation would do. So let me explain it. Because Leslie Kramer of Investopedia in June 25th, 2019, points out that if there's a decrease in the supply of goods while demand remains the same, prices tend to rise to a higher equilibrium price. And so when we affirm today's piece of legislation, the government decreases the supply of food in the United States. Thus, prices will rise. And when we do that, we actually harm every single US constituent because every single person has to pay more for food. And that's why we negate today's piece of legislation, because it harms low-income communities specifically where they already have a low amount of money to spend on food to begin with. But it's not only those who can pay, it's also those who don't even have the money to pay for food. Because as the Texas Tribune in April 8th, 2020 reports, the primary source of donated food is the retail community, which is why so many food banks are struggling now as grocery stores become depleted. So when we affirm today's piece of legislation, let's be very, very clear, Representative Vias, we are going to end up harming the low-income constituents that we are trying to help. We're going to end up spending money feeding these students of really wealthy families, and we're giving them free lunches. But what that means is that we're taking food away from those less fortunate individuals. That's something that I can't stand for. Because if we're going to help people, let's help the correct people. Let's prop people up rather than tearing them down and tearing the last support system that is there for them, the food banks. And that's why I stand on firm negation of today's legislation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes, 18 seconds. All questioners be placard. We'll go to Representative Martinez, Representative Blue, Gardner, followed by Palcic.
Hi, Mr. Wu.
Representative Wu.
So how does the providing of food to these schools exactly work? Like, where do they get it supplied from?
Well, obviously, the Department of Agriculture gets to buy the food, and I assume they're going to get it from places like the supermarkets.
No, but that's the thing. Even in today's legislation, it explicitly talks about food providers like Cisco. That's more of a wholesale food provider. So are we going to see the same impacts when schools aren't really buying from places like Walmart or Target?
Yes.
Why?
Because these grocery stores are still buying from these large food suppliers.
But they're not providing school lunches, so how are they selling?
Anyone who needs to
You're muted, Representative Liu.
I'm so sorry about that. So hi, Senator, great speech. So in your speech, you stated that we're going to be depleting sources, but isn't it in the legislation saying that we're going to be buying unsold produce? So which basically means the leftovers of the produce.
Great, then still my second contention still stands with that we're taking away food from those people that are homeless. Those people don't.
Hey, Representative, what does Section 1 of today's legislation say?
I would need to pull it up again.
That we're going to fully subsidize the industry to provide breakfast and lunch. What does that mean in today's legislation when we pass?
We provide breakfast and lunch to
How many
students.
fossil fuel subsidies are we contributing right now within the status quo?
I believe billions of
Why
dollars.
can't we decrease other subsidies to ensure that prices won't go up?
Thank you. Great speech, Representative. So my first question to you is, you seem extremely concerned with the economic side of this debate. So if people aren't paying money, whether they're rich or poor, for lunch, what are they spending it on?
they're going to be able to save it or spend it on other items that they'd like.
Exactly. So that's going to be more circulation in the economy while they're also getting more food that they don't have to pay for their children. Correct?
Sure, but some people don't have children and they're still low income.
Thank
and
you,
they will get
Representative.
harmed.
Thank you. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as there was a speech in negation, all affirmative speakers, please rise. Representative Palcic.
Thank you. Once again, that's Representative Palcic from Arizona. Can everyone hear me okay? I know the internet's been cutting in and out. Great. All right, so if I could get an indication from my judges when they're ready, that would be amazing. 1, 2, 3. Great. All right. This morning, I received a large package from Capitol Hill with all of the food I would need for my next 2 days of online sessions. But as I ate my congressional 5-course breakfast and looked at statistics for this bill about hunger in America, I suddenly lost my appetite. We need to stop letting the privileges this office grants us blind us to the needs of our hungry constituents. Let's feed our children and pass this bill. Now, this entire debate has been heavily focused on hunger and lunch shaming, but I want to shift the focus to education for everyone in our country. The first reason that we must pass today's legislation is because it helps our students learn more in class. This is true because first, students can focus on their next math test instead of when they are going to have their next meal. And second, a reduction in hunger increases cognitive function. Specifically, a Syracuse University Center for Policy Research study concludes that students retain the equivalent of 6 to 10 weeks of additional knowledge through increased cognitive function and memory when they were given universal free breakfast and lunch. And now, it's not that eating eggs in the morning makes you a math genius, but students are proven to be more engaged in the classroom when their brains are functioning at full capacity. This engagement is empirically quantified by the aforementioned Syracuse study, which also found a 32% increase in math scores and a 27% increase in English scores for students who had access to universal free lunch at school for the first time. Representative Wu, when students perform better in schools, they are more likely to attend a college or university, which gives them the advantage in the fight against poverty, which deprives them of the meal in the first place, providing that economic benefit for low-income families that you are looking for. Now, second, Representative Saxena was wondering why we need universal lunches when we have free and reduced programs. So, Representative, this is why. We must pass this bill because free lunch at schools is more important now than ever. According to the New York Times, on July 30th, 2019, Representative Vias explained that President Trump proposed to take 500,000 students off of free and reduced lunch programs, but he didn't explain what that means for American children. Allow me to. The COVID-19 pandemic is going to lead to more students requiring these programs. According to Vox, just yesterday, 45 million jobs are at risk of being eliminated, and the workers who have to provide for their children in these sectors are already living near or under the poverty line. And when it took us 8 years to recover from the recession of 2008, which had an unemployment rate of 10% at its peak, and we're expecting double that by September, American families are going to need as much long-term assistance as possible. To help students experiencing poverty both now and in the long term, I urge you to stand with me and pass this bill.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes, 29 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Any questioners? Any questioners at this time?
There are questioners.
I think my video is lagging and I'm not seeing anybody raise their placard.
Representative Baron, Representative Saxena, Joel, and Mangalik all have their placards raised. From what I can see.
Okay, now I see Representative, and now I see everybody raising their placard. That question goes to Representative Mangalik. No, Representative Saxena. Followed by Representative Mangalik.
Hi, Representative. So you mentioned how Trump was planning to cut the free and reduced lunch program, right?
Yes.
But who funds free and reduced lunch? Is that Congress or is that the president?
Well, it's going to be the president, but what he was doing is eliminating
How is
SNAP
it going
benefits
to
for low
be?
income. So I'll explain. So the plan in his proposed plan was going to eliminate SNAP benefits for most families across the country. Now,
But
what this would
who
do
funds
is get
SNAP?
rid.
Is that Congress or the president? Who
It's-
allocates that funding?
It's the budget.
Yeah, so who comes up with the budget? Is that us?
Mangalik.
Hi, Senator. So what I was trying to understand is what exactly is the distinction or the benefit to having universal lunch, whereas just raising the threshold at which students are eligible to get reduced lunch prices?
Sure. So that's a good question, and something that I was surprised our sponsor didn't really touch on. But basically what it means is that not only have studies shown that the lower income people, the people who need these universal free lunches, get drastically improved test scores, but there have been improved test scores for people who are on universal free lunch that don't necessarily need
But
it.
why? Like, what's the warrant?
That's just what studies have shown. And largely it's because, as well as lunch shaming and how that doesn't happen anymore.
Thank
But
you,
lunch shaming
Representative.
isn't
The questioning period is
relevant,
elapsed.
right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Uh,
Hello? Thank you. The questioning
yeah,
period is elapsed.
Aren't there? Okay.
Seeing as though it was a speech in affirmation, the chair is now seeking negative speakers to please rise at this time. Negative speakers.
Okay, so Mr. Mangalik, Mr. Baron, and Mr. Joel are raising placards.
Mr. Mangalik.
Hi, I'm Senator Manglik. I'll begin with a thumbs up from the judges. Often with the best
Kind of
intention.
having a bad round. I'll try to get that.
Sorry? Did the PO speak?
I also heard something.
I think the PO's camera is just lagging a little bit.
Parley, would you like me to continue?
Yeah, so I'm just going to mute the PO and you can start and go on. Yes.
All right, thank you. Even with the best of intentions, this Congress often takes bad action. Let me give you some food for thought. Let's first understand why today's legislation definitively will plunge far more Americans into food insecurity than it will uplift. But further, why it's an inherently inefficient program and why it doesn't increase or help the situation at all. So first, now, Senator Wu already told you about how we're going to be hurting tens of millions of Americans, but I'm going to separate myself from him by providing you the evidence that he was lacking. The Atlantic's in January of 2012 explains that in a study, more than half of supermarkets surveyed donated more than 100,000 tons of unsold produce every year. Now, a senator in questioning said that today's legislation specifically says that we will be buying from wholesale producers, but that's just not true at all. It just says that we'll be buying unsold produce. What that means is that food pantries won't have the ability to actually receive those unsold produce because they don't have the financial funds to compete. That's extremely problematic because the Department of Education just this week explains that there are 50 million students currently enrolled in public school education. That's 50 million meals that potentially have to be supplied every day because we won't know who's actually going to be using these free lunches. But it comes at an outrageous cost. The Washington Post in August of 2014 explains that there are 46 million Americans who are currently relying on food pantry donations to survive. Those 46 million Americans are going to lose their vital source. But understand that fundamentally, the affirmative has no inherent reason why a universal free lunch program is so much better than just providing lunches to students who can't afford it. All of the arguments so far have rested on the fact of the existing problems with free and reduced lunch programs, but those are addressed when you raise the threshold and get rid of lunch debt shaming. The problem is that when you are trying to feed 50 million students every day, you're no longer able to feed the 46 million people that rely consistently on these same unsold produce. But further, understand that we are going to be hurting the efficiency of our system because having a massive redistribution program is inherently bad. The Atlantic in May of 2015 cites Elise Golan, the current director of sustainable development at USDA. She explains that the logistics of getting safe, wholesome, edible food from anywhere to people that can use it is extremely difficult, but especially when you have a centralized agency like the USDA actually running the program. Because if you're having to set up a really expensive system to recover marginal amounts of food, that's not good for anybody. In USDA's own words, this program is going to be massively inefficient. You're going to be spending expensive resources on moving around food instead of using those same resources to give kids the free food they deserve. Now, I want to touch on Senator Patson. She gives you evidence from Syracuse University talking about how if you give free breakfast and free lunch, then performance goes up for students who need it the most. Here's the kicker. Today's legislation uses the resources on giving free lunch to everyone instead of free breakfast to whoever needs it. That's unacceptable.
Hello. Thank you, Representative. Were you able to hear me?
I was not.
Okay. I think is everybody able to hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll move to period, but this raise the placard by raising your hand. If there's a hand raising, please do that to raise your placard because my connection is pretty unstable and I'll try to reconnect before we move to the next speaker. With that being said, all who wish to question the speaker, please raise your hand.
In the chat, Ms. Gruber just texted that she would like us to take a small break so that you could restart your computer.
All right, and we can do that now.
Yeah.
And then we will move straight to the questioning period.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to leave the meeting and then I'll come back.
Also, out of curiosity, how long did the PO say the speech was?
PO did not give a time, but on my end, that speech was about 3 minutes and 28 seconds.
Unfortunately, my connection still isn't working and I'm on my phone, but I'm going to also try to restart my computer. So
this sounds like this is a great time to do that. There are a couple of things that might affect this. If you are too far away from your router, the video streaming quality can go down. If there's a way to move to a room that is a little bit closer to your connection point, that might be helpful. As far as the lag, I think something that might help this room move a little faster is if people put their names either in chat or use the hand raise function that Zoom has to stand up for speeches or to stand up for questions. That way that we don't have to worry about whether or not the PO can see your video.
Just a question for the judges and the parliamentarian. Can we use our phones to time ourselves if we're worried about the hand signals and all not coming through?
Yeah,
I mean, I personally don't have a problem with it. I mean, I know the tournament rules say, and I'm sure you're all aware, you're not supposed to be communicating with anyone else. So with that understanding and trusting that, no one's doing that, I certainly don't have a problem with that.
Thank you.
I got my video to finally work, so I'm here. Woohoo.
What a personal privilege.
Yeah, state.
Exit chamber.
All right, granted.
Thanks.
Thank you all for bearing with this. This is sort of a a big experimental thing. I don't think there's been a Zoom tournament on this scale before. So we really appreciate everybody's willingness to work with us.
I would like to apologize for going so long. I couldn't really see the PO or hear him tap his gavel. That's really my bad. I'm sorry about that.
We're all figuring this out together, so we'll figure it out.
And then just a point of inquiry, since I'm also like the whole timing was really weird for me. Just out of curiosity, how long was my speech? Since like I felt like it was longer than it was said, but like I could have my entire clock like messed up.
Yeah.
So the recorded time that the PO gave you was 2 minutes and 18 seconds.
Do you know where to get disposable gloves? A supply, or can we have some?
Okay, Mr. Winder, are you all good?
I am all good. I see everything. Everything looks like it's moving a little clearer now. I've restarted the computer.
Touch stuff.
Okay, something that I mentioned while you were in the process of restarting is if there's a way for you to move so that you are closer to the router in your home, that might be easier. Perhaps at the next recess. There is still a little bit of lag. There's also a fan above you, and just from a video streaming perspective, the way the fan is interacting with the light may be causing some lag. But I recommended to your chamber that they use either the chat function or the hand raise function to stand up for speeches and for questions for right now.
Right. And for speeches and questions, there's the hand raise feature. So just if you do the hand raise for that, that's probably the best. I can also use the hand raise feature at 3:10 when there would normally be a verbal stop. I'll use the hand raise there. That's okay with everybody.
Okay.
All right, it looks like we are back in
Are
business.
we all good to? Okay, so now we're moving on to the questioning period. All who wish to question the speaker, please raise your placard or raise your hand. Representative Martinez.
Okay, so you brought up the fact that we're going to providers that are ultimately going to force this country into food security, similar to what Mr. Wu brought up earlier.
Right.
But again, look at today's legislation. It means food providers. Can you name the food provider in your school district? I'm sure it's not a supermarket.
That's not what the legal definition is, or the intent of the bill. The intent of the bill is to get unsold produce to schools to use it. The problem is that this unsold produce is necessary for other Americans.
But the federal government is not going to go to a source that's going to jeopardize millions of Americans. They've been doing this program for years. Why are they going to do it now?
In my own school, there is a contractor that handles handles the lunches, but that contractor can get the food from wherever they want. And that's something that we can do with this legislation, but that isn't good.
VS.
Okay, thank you. So are you saying that if we pass today's legislation, all of the food banks are going to be depleted of their supply?
I'm saying that they're going to have to compete with the USDA for their unsold produce, which is very inefficient. But further, what I'm saying, and this is the most important point, is that we're spending valuable resources on giving everyone free lunch instead of giving the kids who really need food free breakfast and other programs.
Kids need free food. It's not just some of them.
That's not true though, Representative, because there are many kids who are comfortable.
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed.
Thank you.
Point
Seeing as that was a
privilege to address
your privilege. Granted.
I think that we're using a couple different metrics of the hand raise system, so I just want to make sure we were all on the same page. I know a few of the people, if you go to the participants tab, there's been a few of us that are raising those hands. We're also using the reactions and the placards. I was just wondering if we could like decide on like one metric, I guess, so that we're not like only looking at
Yeah.
one.
If you click raise hand, then that will make a little hand emoji pop up in the corner of your screen on the gallery view here. So that would be the best thing to do.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Seeing as that was a speech and the negation, the chair is now seeking affirmative speakers to please rise at this time. Please use the hand raising feature. Representative Faraj.
I thank the chair. I just wanted to let all the judges know, I'm sure you've been made aware, I completely missed the first 3.5 speeches. So I apologize if anything I'm saying sounds rehashy. I'm just trying my best to come up with something unique. So please let me know when you're all ready. And I'm Representative Faraj, that's spelled F-A-R-A-J. Great. And the second judge? Okay, I'm gonna get started then. There are a few universal principles that we can all agree in this chamber. We can all agree that food insecurity is a problem running rampant inside America. And we can all agree that as a Congress representative of all Americans, it is our duty to take action to solve this problem. This legislation is the way that we can actually do that. Let me clarify one problem and one big misconception that we've had throughout this round. I'm sure that a representative on either side of today's debate has already explained that under the National School Lunch Program, students living under 130% of the poverty rate have access to free lunch. But let's realize that that's not always true, because as the Food Research and Action Center explains in August of 2019, while 12 states have a requirement to actually follow this program, 15 states still have absolutely no requirement to do so. This means that in many districts, even if a student qualifies and has access to that, they still can't access the food that they need. And those students are still left paying for meals that they can't afford. But when we pass today's legislation and ensure that we have universal breakfast and lunch, we can actually see more students participating in school lunches. As a July 2019 report by the Center for Policy Research at Syracuse University found, the Universal Free Meals pilot program inside New York City actually increased wholesale participation in a school lunch by roughly 16.4%. You see, representatives, sometimes it's not that a student can't afford a meal, but in many cases, they either forgot their lunch or their parents forgot to pay for their meals. Under this program, students who would otherwise not be getting the meals that they so much need, regardless of their economic status, are now going to have that access. But one of the bigger and one of the more unique impacts of passing this legislation is that we actually eliminate the need for education funding to be used to pay off meal debt. The School Nutrition Association reveals in their 2019 School Nutrition Trends Report that 75% of school districts nationwide had unpaid meal debt, causing them to have to dip into education funding to pay off these debts. Every single year, more and more valuable education funding is being spent paying off meal debts. Education funding is what helps students have access to new textbooks or new technology to actually grow their knowledge. But just a small increase in education funding could mean the difference between a 20-year-old curriculum and a brand new and much better curriculum for students to learn from. Passing federally funded breakfast and lunch ensures that this problem actually ends so that education funding can be put aside as it's meant to be. Finally, Representative Mangulik told us that we can just increase the threshold, but realize that determining this threshold is incredibly difficult. At the end of the day, if we want to help the most Americans as possible, we have to pass this legislation. Affirm.
through that speech of 3 minutes, 9 seconds. All questioners, please rise. Any questioners?
I believe he needs us to use those emoji signals. So if you're holding up your placard, try that instead.
Yes.
Representative Wu, Palcic, and Mangalik are also holding up their raise hands. If you go to participants and then you click that, then you'll be able to see the list of raise hands that are permanent, so they don't go away unless you lower your hand yourself.
Now we'll go to Representative Wu, followed by Representative. We'll go to Representative Wu first.
All right, Representative. So when you affirm today's piece of legislation, you would obviously take food away from the less fortunate individuals in society, as Representative Mangalik and I have already stated, correct?
Yeah, so I actually disagree with that fundamentally. I wanted to ask a question about this earlier, but I didn't get a chance. Essentially, the biggest reason why these food pantries exist is because there's such a high desire for people to get extra meals. But if schools are providing 2 meals a day, then that desire actually goes down. So now these food banks don't even need as much supply in the first place.
But you would agree that these food banks would have a tougher time supplying food to these homeless people that may not even have children to begin with, right?
No, I actually disagree with that. I think that there's still going to be
Representative
supply,
Representative Joel.
Hi, Representative.
Representative Joel.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So why wouldn't we just take the already established program and make it mandatory for state participation instead of universalizing it?
Because the problem right now is that threshold doesn't even reach enough children. That's what everyone else on my side has told you. Say that again.
Why can't we increase the threshold instead of?
Yeah, I didn't get to finish this point in my speech, but essentially determining that threshold is really difficult because every single state has a different standard for how many people actually need it. So if we have a federal blanket, blanket level, not everyone will get what they need.
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as there was a speech in negation, we'll now see speeches in the affirmation to please rise at
Point
this
of order.
time.
Point of order.
Is there a state that point of order?
It was an
Representative Wu?
affirmation speech.
Seeing as there was a speech in the affirmation, all negative speakers, please rise. We have Representative Baron and Representative Joel raising their hands. Representative Baron.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, this is just Jonathan Baron, spelled B-A-R--O-N. An indication when everyone was ready would be sublime. We're all good? One. Judge Gray. Awesome. Parliamentarian. Perfect. Our free lunch programs are similar to the food pyramid. They rely on a strong, healthy amount of locally produced, freshly sourced food. They allow us to support our kids with the nutrition they need to fuel their studies and become the leaders of our society. This bill, however, threatens that balance by ripping out the most crucial rung, healthy farm produce. Fail today's legislation because while across this country injustice has been ingested for far too long, today's legislation is only another serving of suffering. So speakers on both sides of today's debate have assumed that this bill provides the funds necessary to implement this bill effectively, but that couldn't be further from the truth. According to New York City Independent Budget Office fiscal analysis in February of 2017, this program will cost close to $500 million to fund. But funding allocation in Section 3E, which levies additional taxes and all new revenue will be earmarked to this program, has a large problem. Because using data from the Tax Policy Institute, they estimate that this amounts to only $100 million, only a fifth of the necessary funding. So Representatives Vias, Polchik, and Faraj, all your impacts never are going to come to fruition because the funding isn't there. But don't worry, because Section 3B allows the USDA to negotiate down prices for food and drink, bringing that $500 million down. But that's the most dangerous impact of this bill, because the reason that so many states are hard pressed to fund their free lunch programs is that they often spend more money buying food from small local farms in an effort called Farm to School, which my home state of New York actually led the flagship test of this program for. And on October 9th of 2019, the New York State government explained that this program helps K-12 schools increase the purchase of locally grown and produced food for school meals and provides increased economic benefits to New York farmers. And it's actually begun to happen on a national level. But that's all gone away with today's legislation because these local farms already cost a ton of money. Now the federal government will be working with only a fifth of the budget that they need. So they are more likely to use large corporate producers, which can sell them more domestic produce for less. But that's a huge problem because The Guardian in October of 2017 explains how large industrial farms also produce lower quality, unhealthier produce and have a much larger environmental footprint, releasing dangerous chemicals into their communities. And the past 4 speeches have all focused on the economy, so it almost seems churlish to refuse to keep talking on this. So not only do we neglect the health of our students in our schools, but also the economic health of our constituents, because the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in December of 2017 explains how local farms create 3 times more jobs in their communities than large corporate ones do. So when Mr. Vyas talks about how people can't afford school lunch, this program would only make it so that fewer children receive unhealthy lunch from the unaffordability of today's legislation, and their parents and communities would suffer as well. Ms. Polchik and Ms. Faraj both talk about the educational impacts of this bill, but Ms. Polchik's study only focuses on state level programs funded on a local level, and the funding just isn't there on the national. The affirmation wants us to focus on the harvest that it reaps from this bill. But when we look at the seeds it sows of economic disparity and hardship, we see the crop is corrupted and we have to fail.
Speech of 3 minutes, 8 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Go to Representative Representative Martinez, Representative Liu.
Talking.
Point of inquiry.
Representative Liu.
Oh, so I will be going first. Okay, thank you. Hi, Senator, great speech. So did you mention that this bill is only going to create unhealthy school lunches? Is that what you said?
I said that it's the economics of this bill force us to go to larger corporate farms which produce unhealthier food.
Okay, but can you explain to me how school lunches currently work in the status quo?
Like we have the National School Lunch Program, which has different like nutritional levels. And
right,
so
but what's happening is that they're delivering ingredients to the schools, but the schools can't afford to make the meals themselves. So they're giving it to the corporations already. Isn't that already happening in the current situation? So how does that change?
Because that's prepackaged food. That's prepackaged food. We're talking about direct produce, the ones that we're already using in these farm to school programs.
Aren't we already using direct produce? Thank you.
Did you call on me? I couldn't hear you.
Type in the chat maybe who you called.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna start questioning. So are the only form of subsidies under today's legislation only on this increased tax revenue?
Section 3E.
Right,
yeah.
But fully subsidized, does that not mean that we can also incorporate other means of funding, or does it strictly have to be through Section 3E?
Well, like Section 3E is the only funding mechanism that we have for this bill.
But why can't the
it doesn't
fully
say
subsidized
that we're going to
used in
take funds
Section
from
1
other things?
also apply towards other subsidies?
Okay, so what are we going to take? Well, like, what are we going to take from? It doesn't say. So I'm using the framework set by this piece of legislation.
That was time, so I'm gonna.
Just a quick point of inquiry.
This is type confusing.
Representative Winder, can you see my reactions? I'm just curious.
Right now?
Like, let me try right now and see if you can see it. Because
That's
I
not the
haven't
reaction we're
given a
using.
question yet and I didn't get the question.
You have to go to the participants tab. So like click
Yeah,
more.
that's what I'm on.
So I have
did
to do
not put a
this.
reaction.
For Miss Faraj, if you go to participants and then there's one in the bottom left corner, it says raise hand. And that's how
Okay,
it goes.
thank you. I'll try that next
Yeah, no
time.
worries.
Yeah.
Cool beans.
And then can the PO next time just like put who he'd like to give questions in the group chat rather than just like saying it, because like you cut out and everyone was confused for a moment.
Right, I'll do that to mitigate confusion. I'll just put the questioners in the chat. Just raise your hand in the participants list if you want to get a question or a speech. Seeing that was a speech and negation, we'll move on to affirmative speakers. People wishing to speak in the affirmation, please raise your hand. Representative Martinez, and I will put that in the chat too.
I thank the chair. Whenever my judges are ready, I'm Representative Martinez. Please give me a thumbs up if you're ready, and if you're not, just let me know, and I'll be happy to wait. Great, thank you so much. Imagine that you've won the National College Football Championships. You've worked your entire life to be here, and your countless hours of training have finally paid off. You're invited to meet the President of the United States at the White House. And when you arrive, he awards your hard work with McDonald's and Burger King. There is no other moment which encompasses this administration's nutrition standards like the 1,000 burger fast food buffet that greeted the Clemson Tigers in 2018. These presidential slip-ups shouldn't stop us from raising the standards of the school lunch system. So we must pass this piece of legislation. First, pass this bill because it betters conditions for cafeteria workers. Look to Section 1, where it tells us the federal government is now going to subsidize the providing of food to students K through 12, increasing the amount of money that schools are getting. We need to understand that one aspect of providing the food is hiring and paying people to provide it. And a problem that we see in our current school lunch systems is that often cafeteria workers are severely underpaid. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us on March 29th of 2019 that food preparation workers in schools receive the lowest wages out of any other faculty member in public schools, earning about $26,440 a year. I find it horrendously ironic that the people that serve our children food cannot even have food for themselves. And it goes even beyond their pay because it translates to other aspects of their livelihood. As Mariah Belinget writes for the Washington Post on April 25th of 2018, telling us that school support workers earn so little that many qualify for public benefits, food stamps to feed their children, Pell Grants to attend college, and Medicaid for their children's care. By passing today's legislation, cafeteria workers can make living wages and actually be able to sustain a livelihood. Regardless of what your job is, it should not define your ability to make a living for yourself and your family. It is long overdue that cafeteria workers can receive a wage raise. But second, we must pass this piece of legislation to eliminate school food waste. Now, current school lunch programs don't utilize offer versus serve, meaning that when we give lunch to students, they have to eat everything on their plate, or so we say, because often millions and millions of that food accumulates as food waste because students are not eating everything we give them. And that translates to even bigger impacts, as a comprehensive study by the World Wildlife Fund published in December of 2019 tells us that school food waste contributes 1.9 million metric tons of CO2 emissions and costs $9.7 million to manage every single day. Every single negation speaker is so concerned about cost. Mr. Baron, Mr. Mangaling, and Mr. Wu, when they tell us we can't afford this, we're already spending $10 million every day on food waste. Of course we can. This new program provides more flexibility so students can have the option of having food. We need to help our current children and help our future children by passing this bill.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes, 55 seconds. Sorry I wasn't able to give you the second time signal because my video left the Zoom and then it came back. All questioners, please raise your hands. I'll go to Representative Faron.
Hi, Senator. Great speech. So what does Section 3B of today's legislation say? Or Section 3A say?
Section 3A of today's legislation says the Department of Agriculture is going to buy unsold produce from domestic sources at cost.
Right. So when you talk about this food waste, that's not really covered under today's legislation, though.
Well, the thing is, we're changing the program because the current reduced food
Right,
program,
but that's not under today's legislation.
we can do it if we'd like to, because basically the USDA is already making efforts to minimize costs. In fact, that's the reason they conducted that study about food waste, because a study about food waste, because they know it's a problem. They're going to try to streamline our ability to reduce the amount of food waste.
Right, but today's legislation doesn't let us buy food waste.
They're already planning on doing it. That's why.
But that changes. That's what Section 5 says.
Representative Paltic.
Thank you. Representative, so in your second point with regards to food waste, where in the bill does it mandate that students should stop bringing their own lunch?
So we're not stopping students from bringing their own lunch. That's different. A lot of the food waste is contributed from the reduced lunch we're giving students, and they're often throwing away things on the plate that we're providing.
So what's different now?
So the USDA already has addressed the fact that food waste is a problem, and Secretary Perdue has announced that they're making efforts to streamline the amount of food waste we have.
But under this bill, what gets rid of food waste?
We're
Because
getting
there's going to be more food in schools.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the speech and affirmation. Negative speakers, please raise your hand. Representative Joel, you have the floor as you stand unopposed.
I thank the chair. That's Representative Joel, J-O-E-L, speaking for the first time in this legislative session. I'm at the leisure of those above me, so give me any indication when you're ready. There is no such thing as free lunch is a popular adage communicating the idea that it's impossible to get something for nothing. Regarding this legislation that we are debating today, that saying takes on new meaning, given the unpalatable cost of the affirmation. So principally, fail because today's legislation is throwing good money after bad. Like previous speakers have mentioned, the National School Lunch Program guarantees that low-income children are eligible to receive reduced price or free meals at school. Given that this program already exists, Representative Farage, why should we universalize it instead of simply making state participation mandatory? And Representative Palcic, if you want more inclusion in the program, by all means, cut down bureaucratic red tape or tie the threshold to the state cost of living. But I draw the line at spending billions of taxpayer dollars to provide free school lunches to people who can already afford to pay. That is money that should be spent on poverty alleviation, so that this country has more kids who can depend on their families to feed them and not the government. Representative Valles, if you really want to get rid of lunch debt stigma, this Congress should pass stop lunch shaming laws like California and Texas, which get rid of the draconian practices without increasing taxes. In the words of journalist H.L. Melkin, there is always an easy solution to every problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. This bill is one such solution. But second, fail today's legislation because it worsens the health of America's children, but just not for the reasons Representative Barron gives. By universalizing free lunch, this Congress creates a perverse incentive for students to switch over to school lunches, even if their family can afford to send them a packed lunch for the sake of convenience. A 2014 study by the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics found that approximately 48% of school children bring lunch from home, a number that would plummet as America's families grow more dependent on the government to feed them. While conceptually innocuous, the devil is in the nutrition label. Section 3D's so-called federal nutrition standards routinely change depending on the administration. Professor Levine writes that the USDA is beholden to the corporate food and food service industries. In school lunches, nutrition takes a backseat to markets and prices. Business Insider reports this year that under pressure from the potato lobby, the Trump administration's USDA has classified French fries as vegetables, as well as rolled back sodium intake regulations. It's no wonder that a Northwestern University study found that kids who eat school lunches are 29% more likely to be obese than kids who brought their lunch from home. Realize what this means for future generations. A Harvard study found that obesity increases the risk of cardiovascular mortality by 49%, and respiratory disease mortality by 38%. There really is no such thing as free lunch. And by passing this legislation, we pay with the health of our constituents. Vote to fail.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes, 59 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Question goes to Representative Farage.
Hi, Representative. So you just kind of contradicted yourself there. If parents realize that these standards are not up to par, why would they not send their children to school with the lunch they've packed themselves?
It's for the sake of convenience. If families know that their
Is it
kid can get lunch
convenient
for
for
free
their
at
child to
school,
develop health issues for them?
well, I would argue that we're the government of the United States. We don't represent the interests of every single parent, and we
Okay.
can't vouch for their parenting
But
decisions.
regardless of that, why can't we just increase or make better the standards for the actual lunches that students are receiving? That way, obesity isn't even a problem in the first place.
So the standards are determined by the executive branch.
So you're suggesting a counter plan in which we initiate laws against the stigma of lunch shaming. But isn't that psychological? I don't think we're going to be penalizing 5-year-olds for making fun of their other students that have to produce lunch.
So the fact of the matter is that it's often the schools, not other classmates, that are stigmatizing kids through practices like forcing them to not sit at recess.
Recognizing the student needs reduced lunch. So why don't we just make it universal and take away that psychological aspect?
You take away the psychological aspect by creating a same line for free lunch.
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as there was a speech in negation, affirmative speakers, please raise your hand. It goes to
Seems to be
Representative
a motion to
Saxena.
personal privilege.
Oh, excuse me. State that privilege.
Exit the chamber.
Granted. The chair recognizes Representative Saxena.
I thank the chair. For the judges, hello, my name is Representative Saxena, Saxena. And as always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me. So if you could just give me any indication when you're ready, that would be great. Good. And is the parliamentarian, oh, okay, great. Okay. All right. People say you are what you eat. So I guess that means the negation has had a big bowl of misunderstanding for lunch during our recess. So first, Representative Wu and Mengalik's entire speeches are based off of the premise that the food supply chain is going to go down, but that's just not the truth. According to Section 3A, the Department of Agriculture is going to buy unsold produce from domestic sources. Section 3C says the Department of Education is going to coordinate with state education departments to transition their food sourcing. Target and Walmart are not the sources of domestic food. Even if they were, America's just not going to run out of money. That's not how it works. So now that we've cleared up those misconceptions, let's actually start to weigh the impacts of today's legislation. Representative Baran just told us that a lot of high schools are reliant on local food, but it's just not as important as he makes it out to be. NPR tells us in 2015, on average, only about 13% of the food budgets at the 33% of schools that even served local food actually went to school that was grown nearby. So out of the 1/3 of all schools who even rely on local foods, 1/10 of their budgets is dedicated to local food. Even if he says that this is going to be a major catastrophe, let's see what the positive benefits are. Representative Baran and Mangalik all tell Representative Vyas that we should just raise the threshold. There's no point in a universal system. But let's understand that it's not just about access to food, but access to quality food. Because when you pass today, you stop obesity from becoming another public health crisis. For the past 30 years, childhood obesity has more than quadrupled. But the rising statistics are no longer going to be a cause for concern under the Universal Free Lunch and Breakfast program. Because now, 2 out of the 3 meals that students are eating every day will follow federal guidelines. Representative Joel told us that this will actually mean that nutrition takes a back seat. But see where his study went wrong. Even if kids were more obese because they were enrolled, that's because they were that they were part of a low-income demographic, which is shown to be more obese. But But let's see what happens when they actually enrolled in the free and reduced lunch program. Another CDC study tells us in 2016 that there's actually a decline in obesity rates among low-income children that participated in federal nutrition programs. So federal guidelines actually are effective at decreasing obesity. Now we just need to extend them to the entire nation. But next, the positive impacts aren't just on public health, but also school quality. Currently, we use the free and reduced lunch program as a proxy measure of poverty for dozens of government and local programs. But that's a bad thing because of a concept known as community eligibility. When over 40% of a school's population is on free and reduced lunch, the whole school automatically gets free lunch. That's good for the school, but bad for our data. Brookings tells us that states are permitted to exempt community eligibility schools from reporting separate data, which means that disadvantaged students are just forgotten entirely. Understand that when you pass today's piece of legislation, you force us to adapt to a more comprehensive metric and represent all students, regardless of zip code.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 8 seconds. All questioners, please raise your hand. Question will go to Representative Mangalik.
Hi, Representative.
Hi.
So what I don't understand is that if you're trying to help the nutrition of kids who need food, then why would you be spending our limited resources on giving everyone free lunch instead of giving free breakfast or even free dinner to the kids who really need it?
Isn't just limited to our low-income Americans. It's a problem that's taking over the entire US.
Right. So
1 in 3 Americans are now obese. 1 in 3 Americans are not living 130% below the federal poverty line. We help all Americans with this legislation.
So you think that all Americans will be benefiting from eating school lunch instead of packing their own meals?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Representative, how are we going to pay for this? It
Well,
outlines it.
Okay, so well, first off, we're going to be raising income taxes. We also give the Department of Education and the Department of Agriculture to buy unsold produce and negotiate as well.
Yeah, so with regards to the taxes in that section of the bill, those taxes generally focus on the 22% bracket and the 24% bracket.
Right.
Isn't that the middle class, possibly the people who need to keep that money the most?
If we're raising them by 0.0025.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed.
Thank the chair.
Seeing as there was a speech and affirmation, negative speakers, please raise your hand. Make sure to take your hand down if you had it up in the questioning period. Anyone wishing to speak in the negation? Calling one more time just in case there's a delay. All affirmative speakers, we will switch to call for affirmative speakers now. Affirmative speakers, please raise your hand. Representative Liu, you have the floor as you stand on a post.
Just a question, can everyone hear me? It cut out for a second. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Senator Liu. That's L-I-U. And if I could just get a thumbs up from my judges. And my PO.
Good here.
Thank you. And I can't seem to find my other judge. Oh, right there. Thank you. If there's one thing that we as Congress can agree on, it's that when we were children, vegetables were our enemies. It seemed that no matter what mealtime it was, there would be an endless stream of green. But unfortunately, it's the opposite for students in our schools today. Over the last decade, we've seen nutritional development in our schools absolutely plummet, and our efforts to salvage have been all but effective. Stand with me and pass this piece of legislation, and with all the affirmation senators who spoke before me today, and let's move America to a more healthier future, one that our children actually deserve. But first, let's touch on a point that many senators on the negation seem to be championing, the idea of free and reduced meals. Now, Representative Martinez and Representative Saxena brought this up before me about the economic downturns and what others about this, but let's go further and analyze the actual social impacts. Research conducted by the USDA has consistently showed that some school food programs, the federal reimbursement for free and reduced price meals, appeared to subsidize meals provided to higher income children and foods that are offered outside the federal school meal programs, such as less nutritious snack foods and individual items in vending machines, more often than schools who actually need proper meals. But even more, Representative Joel, you continue to advocate against anti-shaming, but understand that free and reduced lunch program has been a forefront runner in the cause of lunch shaming and has been proven by multiple studies conducted by the USDA. Bear with me, Representative Megalik and Representative Joel. I'm a firm believer in helping the poor, but it's because that free and reduced meals has done everything but that. And that's why I want this alternative. And this is why we're going to universalize it instead of raising the threshold, because it'll ultimately go to the rich for simple, luxurious additions to their schools. But next, let's affirm because our pre-existing legislation in our current status quo has failed to actually provide substantive school lunches for our children, and it's been severely exploited by packaging companies. Let's look towards how it currently works. Each day, 32 million children in the United States get lunch at schools that participate in the National School Lunch Program, which uses agricultural surplus to feed children. Because Representative Wu, you concern yourself with the depletion of resources, but you fail to understand what you're worried about is already happening in the status quo, but at no cost. Despite that, it's the largest federal lunch program in the United States, and sadly, it still failed to provide healthy lunches, and there's a clear reason why. As the New York Times explains, the agricultural department pays about $1 billion a year for fresh commodities. Schools get the ingredients for free, but it's actually up to them to prepare the food themselves. But here's the problem. More and more schools are paying processors to turn these healthy ingredients into cheap, processed, and microwavable meals because they simply cannot afford it. Having the meals prepared on site is simply too expensive for them. Some $445 million worth of commodities are sent for processing each year. For so long, we've complained about America's high obesity rate. So let's take this opportunity to change and reverse this issue once and for all. Stand with me and pass. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes, 1 second. All questioners, please raise your hand. Representative Wu.
Representative Liu, I'm still a little bit concerned about your speech when you talk about how we're taking from the agricultural surplus, correct?
Yes, of course.
So then under today's piece of legislation, we're taking even more of this surplus down, correct? And we're decreasing the oversupply.
Right, but the US currently throws away about 50% of what it produces, and I'm sure that we can split this evenly between those who need it and those who go towards school lunch programs. There's simply no cost at having it done both ways.
What does today's piece of legislation do to decrease the food waste?
Right, so it's buying unsold produce from agricultural surpluses, which is what we're doing in the status quo currently as well. So we're trying to minimize food waste as much as possible, aren't we?
And so we're going to be decreasing the amount of consumption at supermarkets, correct?
Yes.
So then these supermarkets are going to struggle, right?
Altic.
Okay, it's me.
Altic.
Okay, thank you. Representative, thank you for that great speech. So you spoke about in your second point about how the poor quality of food is a really bad problem now.
Yes.
But given that this bill says it's going to follow the same standards of healthy food regulations, what's going to change?
So the reason why there's such a poor food quality is because schools can't afford to prepare it on site. If we actually federally subsidize the entire process and prepare the meals ourselves by the government, I think we can provide a healthier option so that schools don't have to prepare it themselves.
Where in the bill is the government preparing these meals?
It's federally subsidizing the entire cost.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
No questioning period. Thank you. Seeing as that was a speech in affirmation, negative speech, please raise your hand. Make sure to take question period.
Motion.
Motion.
State that motion. State that motion, Representative Proudsick.
Seeing no other speakers on the negation, I move to vote on previous question.
Objection.
Is there a second? There's no second, so we'll just continue.
Oh, Representative Gardner has to speak. I'm so sorry. I didn't even see that. I'm sorry.
That's fine. We can continue. The motion was not seconded. Negative speakers, please raise your placard. Representative Gardner, you have the floor as you stand unopposed.
Mr. Gardner, you're still muted.
I apologize. This is Representative Gardner speaking for the second time in this for the first time in today's legislative session. I know we're all dealing with a little bit of lag spikes, so just a thumbs up and hold it, and then I'll tell you when I see it. I see Nathaniel's, I see Allen's, and I see CJ's. All right, we're cool. Pop culture icon, influencer, and famous philosopher Ashley Tisdale, perhaps better known as Sharpay Evans, once said the infamous words, "Stick to the status quo." And in all honesty, I'm more of a fan of Gabriel Montez. But to truly put this saying to the test of today's legislation is a must, because we see when applying how today's legislation interacts in the real world and the effects that it plays on our American citizens, we must fail and stick to the status quo. Now, understand, today's legislative session can be broken up into two main questions, both of which easily fall in line for a negative ballot. First is this question of funding that Representative Barron alluded to on my own side, but where the first author of today's legislation and Representative Martinez and Representative Farzan all touched on when they spoke about subsidies. But realize there are two key reasons as to why there's absolutely no funding necessary for today's legislation. And even if there were funding, it wouldn't be beneficial in the first place. The first one is something that Representative Barron already alluded to. The fact that Section 3E of today's legislation doesn't generate anywhere near enough money to actually fully fund this program. In fact, it only generates $100 million of the $500 million projectedly needed, emphasizing that the arguments every single affirmative speaker and how they want to actually solve for childhood hunger all fall flat in today's debate. But even if you believe that funding somehow magically appears in the dust, you look to the second reason as to why. Because the ballot concludes on July 4th of 2019 that the federal subsidies that come from the Department of Agriculture in a lot of instances are generally extremely problematic because they seek out sources that are cheap and of low quality. This emphasizes that all of the food that is going to be given to these kids, even if there isn't enough funding, isn't going to be beneficial, and they aren't going to be able to succeed in the education field, which has a negative impact on not only their health conditions operating within the real world, but also their educational output. Because we all know that when you have good food and you are able to sustain a higher quality of life, you're more likely to succeed. Give children bad quality food, and that's not going to come into fruition. 16.2 million kids within the United States are going to suffer under today's legislation, which brings me to my next point, which is the fact that we need to ask ourselves about the free lunch system and how it's working now, which every single affirmative speaker has argued is completely and utterly problematic. But realize, Feeding for America identifies that the USDA has already identified that 29.7 million kids qualify for lunch, for free and reduced lunch. But the problem is that there is a sufficient lack of support that today's legislation does nothing to address. Rather, we should look to fail today's legislation and prioritize the free and reduced lunch system. That way we can actually be beneficial towards these kids looking into their future and for the future of this nation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 16 seconds. All questioners, please raise your hand. I'll first go to Representative Barrage.
Hi, Representative.
Hello.
So under Section 3D, we stipulate that the USDA has to follow nutrition standards. If we're so worried about the quality of these meals, why don't we just up those standards?
Well, the problem is today's legislation does nothing to up those standards. It's just saying we're following the
Okay, but we
standards right
literally
now that the
cannot
Department
do
of
that through this
Agriculture already
legislation.
does.
We can't
What?
do that through this legislation. We can do it through other legislation, though. What stops us
can
from
do-
passing that?
But the problem is that we're not going to pass today's legislation.
Why
We're
not?
not going to pass legislation looking into the future because time and time again, obstacles such as the executive
why aren't we
branch and
going to
so
pass
many
better
other obstacles
standards?
operating within these Congress
Saxena.
operate off of a
Thank
completely
you.
conservative
Hi,
mindset they don't want to
Representative.
change.
So I brought in a CDC study that said federal guidelines reduce obesity. How are like federal standards not beneficial?
I'm not saying that federal standards aren't necessarily beneficial. I'm saying that the Department of Agriculture subsidies provided under today's legislation
but
aren't going to benefit these kids.
Okay,
Some federal guidelines do work, just not the ones under today's
We're
legislation.
going to go to sources that have to follow federal guidelines, then how is it not going to be beneficial?
That's what I already touched on in my speech. I told you that the guidelines aren't
Thank
sufficient.
you,
That was the balance.
Thank you. The question period elapsed. The chair will now entertain a motion, seeing everyone has spoken over this piece of legislation. Representative Martinez.
Just wanted to initiate that motion. I apologize.
I'll second.
Second.
Did you move to previous? All in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? We will now move to previous question on this item. All in favor of passing this legislation, please go to the participants list and there is a yes and no button. Please press yes or no. If all in favor of the legislation, obviously put yes. If you were voting in negation, put no. So you can check my counting here. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in favor. That is the majority vote, and 4 and 5 against. So this legislation does pass. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Representative Menglik,
I move for a 5-minute recess.
is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Anyone opposed to that? Assuming unanimous consent, please be back here. We'll hit the clock because we're right at the top of the minute. 4:32 Eastern time. 4:32 Eastern time. Please be back here. One question I have, if the parliamentarian is still here.
Yep.
We have had a couple of delays in like technical difficulties and whatnot, and I know that's delayed the round a little bit. Will they let us go like 5 or 10
Yeah.
minutes
Okay. So
past
we
the
can
hard
we can
stop if we need
extend
to do
to
that because of
5:40 if we get there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we might not need to use it, but I think it would be more equitable if we did that.
Quick point of inquiry to the PL. How many questions do I have so far?
I have you marked down for having 2 questions.
Okay, thank you.
That was you had?
I haven't really counted. I think that
Okay,
is
yeah.
around accurate.
Yeah. No one has more than 3.
Wait, point of inquiry. I know. What time are we extending this to?
We can go to 4:40 if we need, or excuse me, 5:40 Eastern time if we need to.
Okay. So with the time that's allocated, I do not think there's enough time for us to do 3 speeches per person. So if we want to move through all the remaining 2 bills, I think that we should split the speakers among the 2 bills.
Yeah, like if y'all want to vote on a cap or a base 2 or something, so it's more equitable.
I almost feel that if we try to split
Just
it,
do one.
we're such a small chamber that we're not going to have like a really like lengthy debate. So maybe we should just debate the next bill and then end, so we won't have any confusion. People don't get excluded.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think if we do, if we do just keep it to even base 2, or if some people do want to give 3 speeches, we should have enough time for that. If we extend it by 2 hours, there's 11 of us in this chamber, so even if we assume like 5 minutes for each speech, that's like 110 minutes. We still have enough time for that. But even so, we can just do, if you want to speak on the first bill, speak on that. If you want to speak on the second, speak on that.
So I think it just comes down
beforehand.
Yeah. So would it just come down to like either choosing to like split the people among the bills or just choosing to like go with one bill and not debate the other?
I think we should just leave it
Go
to
with
how
one
it
bill.
ends up happening. I'm
I
assuming
think it would only call for a full debate if
Right.
we could just get through one. If we split it in half, we're really not going to have a full debate.
Yeah, I agree. We have to make sure everybody can just get their 2 speeches, and so it's fair and even.
So do you guys want to move on to the UNCRC, or did you guys want to move to social media?
Social media.
Social media, probably.
I believe the next item on the docket was the UNCRC.
Yeah.
So I think once
I
everyone's
want
back, we
UNCRC.
should just take a vote on which item we prefer instead of just us kind of deciding.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Sounds
can
good.
we just like right
prefer
now, just like put like a yes for Bill B and then a no for Bill C on the participants list? That way we can just like all vote on it and we have a record.
Okay, we do have enough people for the quorum right now. We can extend the recess if you want to do this.
Or
So
we can just get back in session and vote to amend the docket or not.
yeah, do y'all want to do that? So we'll now go into the quorum.
Let's move into previous question.
And I will now entertain a motion to amend the agenda. Mr. Baron?
Actually, like, this isn't a motion this is a motion to move to previous questioning on the second bill, because we can't amend the docket.
Right, okay, so we will now vote whether or not to move to previous questions. All in favor of moving to previous question, please say yes in the thing. That's if we're moving to previous question or not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is a majority vote to move to previous question. Or excuse me, it is a 2/3 majority required. And we did not meet the 2/3 requirement to move to previous question. So we will move on to, since we're still in decorum, we will move on to debate on item 2B. Are there any authors or sponsors? Sponsors or first affirmatives?
Motion.
Point of inquiry.
Representative Martinez?
Thank you. I'm going to be doing a first affirmative. So again, I'm Representative Martinez. Whenever my judges and presiding officer are ready, please let me know, and I'll be happy to begin.
Just as a brief note to the chamber, I should have better connection since I'm closer to the router, but at least for now, if we can continue using the same system we were using in the last piece of legislation, I think that would be the most efficient.
Yo, you're all good? Thank you so much.
Good here.
The rights of the child have been recognized all over the world. One ratifier of the convention in question, Spain, calls a child un niño. In China, it's jiaozi. In Russia, it's ditia. And in the United States, it's an afterthought. For 30 years, we've refused to ratify one of the most important conventions put forth by the UN. And the children that convention had the purpose of helping now have children of their own. The least we can do is help that generation by helping the one they've raised. Pass this piece of legislation. First, we need to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to end homophobic and abusive practices. Look to Part 1, Article 2, Section 2 of the Convention, stating the state must protect children from harmful practices or inflictions of belief from their parents that pose negative effects on the child. This sets an important precedent for ensuring that children are no longer subject to the practices of conversion therapy, which relies solely on parental consent. And we need to understand that in recent years, the problem has become worse and worse. The UCLA Williams Institute for Law tells us in June of 2019 that 16,000 children will be forced to go through with conversion therapy in the remaining 32 states without bans if state officials do not act in the coming years, increasing rates of mental illness and suicidal thoughts amongst those exposed. But an even bigger issue is that loopholes still remain in the states where bans are in place. In some states, like in California, there's only a ban on licensed medical professionals. And in other states like North Carolina, the only ban is on funding for the practice. This practice rips the livelihood of thousands of LGBTQ youth every single year, and this United States has failed to take any action. We've already respected human rights through another UN convention. The next thing we can do is recognize the rights of the child by ratifying this convention and making it a part of the rights we stand for in the international community. Second, we're going to pass this piece of legislation to protect the children of migrants. If you look to Part 1, Article 9 of the convention, addressing the separation of children from their parents, the rights guaranteed in the section allow the separation to be legally challenged, and the state is required to give children information about the whereabouts of their parents. And this is becoming more and more of a problem as our immigration system continues to have a lack of accountability. In fact, the Office of the Inspector General told us in November 25th of 2019 that the Department of Homeland Security failed to reunite 1,233 children who remained separated from their parents, and neither of which parties, the children or the parents, had a file to give information about the whereabouts of where the other is. But even worse, in 2019, Border Patrol planned to separate 5 times as many families in 2019 as they did in 2018. The problem will only continue to increase if we don't ratify this convention. Children aren't just numbers and quotas, they're human beings. Pass this bill.
Thank you for that speech at 2 minutes, 55 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand in the set participant section like we were doing before. The question will go to Mr. Villas.
All right, thank you. When we join a United Nations treaty, we are able to ratify it with like exceptions, right?
Yeah, like
And
we don't.
So oftentimes when we sign like a UN treaty, we'll make a lot of exceptions that don't go against like the laws we have in place, right?
I can give you an answer. I understand that because the UN law is not sovereign over our own law. But what's important is that when we ratify a convention, we have to submit a report to the UN. When we now increase data about the problems in the United States,
but what prevents the US from not like making any exceptions?
I'm sorry?
What prevents the US from not making any exceptions?
Already do it, but what we already do as well is submit that report to get data about what we're doing and better our policy.
Representative Gardner.
Hello, Representative. So how do United States children's rights compare to that in other countries that have already ratified onto UNCRC?
It's already dependent on the country. For example, China signed it, but they don't have a great track record. But what the United States signing it means is that we have better data allocation about what we do. And obviously, if conversion therapy is still legal, I don't think we're doing the best job out of all the ratifiers.
But here's the thing, if no countries are actually being checked by anything within this
Thank
treaty,
you.
how can we ensure that it...
Convention, actually.
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as that was a speech and affirmation, the chair is now
Point of
seeking
order.
negative.
Point of order. So
Representative
that was
Barron.
an authorship speech. So there are 4 blocks of questioning, not 2.
Yeah, there.
Right. So the third questioner will be Mr. Barron or Ms. Saxena.
Okay. Hi, Representative. Okay, so is being part of the LGBTQ community even legal in all other countries?
No.
Okay, so is conversion therapy then legal in all other countries?
It's dependent on the country. Like in countries like Saudi Arabia, of course it's legal, but that doesn't mean it's okay for the United States to make it legal.
So if we know that joining this treaty actually won't do anything to end the practices unless
No,
we
it's not enforcement. The whole
then how does
point
it
of
do
this is that we can, I'm sorry, we have to create a report so we understand where we're going wrong, and that helps us better our policy. Conventions
Ms. Kautsik.
but not directly.
Thank you. Representative, thank you for that great speech. My first question for you is about how the entire world is actually, like, except the United States is a member of this. So how can you say that the United States joining is going to have a serious impact in changing the things you're so worried about?
So I think that we should establish this for the rest of the debate to avoid conclusion. We don't have to hold ourselves with the UN law sovereign over our law. But what changes is now we're submitting a report with data we've never collected before. And that betters our ability to make policy and we understand where we're going wrong.
But if
Thank
we
you,
already
Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as that was a sponsorship speech, negative speakers, please raise your hand in the participants section. That speech goes to, I just see Ms. Pautsik raising their hand. So the speech now goes to you.
I thank the chair. Once again, for my judges, that's Representative Paltzik from Arizona. If I could get an indication from all of my judges when they're ready, I'll let you know which ones I see. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3. Great. The United States is looked to as one of the most respected members of the United Nations, but this institution is only as strong as the promises its members can fulfill. And when it is the obligation of this Congress to uphold those commitments, we must first make sure we can keep them. Please fail this empty promise. First, fail this resolution because it promotes complacency on human rights issues. The resolution gives us the same excuse that underdeveloped nations have used to build credibility in the UN while violating terms of conventions. According to Lydia Manasan of the Global Fund for Children on September 30th, 2019, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one of the most violated conventions in the world, as Representative Saxena alluded to in questioning. Today, more than 120,000 children are forced to fight their nation's wars, and 168 million children across the world are working in sweatshops. Clearly, this 30-year-old convention is a guise for inaction. But let's take the affirmation at their highest ground and pretend that the United States is different from these countries and will fulfill its obligations to this convention. Historic precedence tells us otherwise. For example, the United States ratified the Convention Against Torture in 1994, but according to The Guardian on January 30th, 2018, it wasn't until 2009 that an order calling for Guantanamo Bay to be closed was signed, and even then, the order was never carried out. And in 1992, the United States ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and yet we have passed no meaningful legislation to help our climate. Guantanamo Bay is still open, and the Environmental Protection Agency is currently run by a coal lobbyist. Clearly, UN conventions have been used by complacent politicians to make statements that sound good instead of pass policies that do good. Representative Representative Martinez, let's stand on the negation and then sit at the table to draft effective legislation and address all of your concerns, specifically those about conversion therapy, which will surely not be solved. But furthermore, we must negate because of the principles of the resolution itself. Representative Martinez, you are so concerned about the livelihood of children throughout your speech, meaning you should really be standing on the negation. Because second, this convention abandons children at the brink of death. This is because the UNCRC strongly discourages international adoption. The American Academy of Political and Social Science explains that Article 21b states that if children leave their home country to be adopted in another country, it should only be if all foster care and adoption orphanages in their home country are full. So under this convention, it is preferable for millions of orphans in war-torn countries to live literally under fire than leave their nation to go somewhere better. According to the Middle East Monitor on November 14th, 2019, there are currently 1.1 million orphans living in Yemen that have to move between pseudo-foster care families providing them with temporary relief. Representative Martinez, you are correct. These children are not numbers and statistics, and we need to treat them as such. We should not support a convention that condones children being raised in war-torn or poverty-stricken nations just because foster homes exist, when a different option also exists. Representatives, fail this empty promise.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 8 seconds.
Thank you.
Questioners, please raise your hand. I'll go to Representative Farage, followed by Representative Liu.
Hi, Representative. Great speech.
Hi, thank you.
So what were the enforcement mechanisms for the past UN conventions that you said that we haven't enforced?
So specifically with the Convention Against Torture and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we have signed on to legally binding.
Yeah, what were those enforcement mechanisms within those?
So specifically with the Convention Against Torture, we legally signed the United States up to end torture and other inhuman.
Does today's legislation do anything more than just signing it? Are there any enforcement mechanisms within the UNCRC?
Yeah, so the UNCRC is a legally binding convention.
Lou?
Great, but there's more than that, right?
May I finish my answer to her question?
Lou?
Okay.
Hi, Senator. So thank you for your speech. So what has the U.S. done to actually try and stop these child soldiers and international child rights violations?
Well, I'm sure you can tell me, but obviously not enough.
Right, so it's not doing enough. So wouldn't ratifying this convention allow us to actually pursue in allowing for international peace and trying to convince these countries to switch?
No, because because many of these countries we're not actually allies with, but also on top of that, every single nation in the world is currently a signature on this.
Right, but if the U.S. as a global leader, if we lead the way and we show them how to act,
too.
Right. So going back a little to what Ms. Farage was talking about. So what does the third whereas clause today explain?
It states that the United States has demonstrated its commitment to this, but again,
right. So it's already been doing parts of the UNCRC, which makes it fundamentally the other ones. What makes it so that if we apply to the entire UNCRC any different than what we've already been doing?
Because there's no reason to pass this when it's only promoting complacency.
Joel?
To stop the legislation.
Joel?
You're on mute.
Sorry.
No
Good speech, Representative. So given that we are Congress after all, what prevents us from following through on this commitment?
Because historic precedent tells us otherwise. And in addition to that, there's also multiple things that we have to make sure not to follow through on, such as the adoption.
So we are Congress though, correct? So why can't next session we propose a
Thank
bill
you,
to actually
Representative.
follow through?
I don't believe we will.
Thank you. The questioning period has elapsed.
Thank you.
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, affirmative speakers, please raise your hand in the participant section. That speech goes to between Representative Liu and Joel. That speech goes to Representative Joel.
I thank the chair. That is Representative Joel speaking for the second time in this legislative session. I'm at the leisure of those above me, so give me a sign when you're ready. I'm going to cut right to the chase. I want to make something very, very clear for this Congress. This is a resolution, not a bill. So Representative Martinez and Representative Paulsik, it is a recommendation for a course of action, not a legal requirement to protect children. Yet even in some unlikely event that the UNCRC is actually ratified by the Senate, it has no impact on US law or sovereignty. Professor of Constitutional Law Julian Koo explains that if the US secedes to the CRC, it will undoubtedly do so without passing new legislation or enacting new programs to live up to the treaty's obligations. As it is done with other human rights treaties it has ratified, the US will declare the CRC non-self-executing, which means it cannot be enforced by US courts absent subsequent legislation. Now, Representative Paulsik is worried about making an empty promise, but I disagree. We are Congress, after all. Passing this resolution shows a commitment that we will be expected to uphold. And while it doesn't tangibly alter US policy or law, the reason to pass today's legislation is to create a mandate for leadership. Former Vice President Hubert Humphrey remarked that the moral test of government is how it treats those at the dawn of life, the children. If that is the case, then this Congress is failing that moral test. As The Atlantic reports in 2017, we are one of the richest nations in the world, yet we have one of the highest rates of child poverty among developed nations. 1 in 25 families with young children lives on about $2 or less per day, a percentage that exceeds or parallels those in Russia, the West Bank and Gaza, and urban China. Infant mortality is more common in the United States than many other economically advanced nations. Law professor Claire Huntington explains that neither the federal government nor state governments have an affirmative obligation to protect and promote children's health. In this sense, policies to promote child health are optional. Representative Peltzik is wrong. Passing this resolution would galvanize the cause, creating a framework for concrete action instead of promoting complacency. Legal scholar Professor Todris finds that most countries that publicly embrace the treaty incorporate some of its aspects into domestic law, especially in terms of strengthening the commitment to addressing child poverty. For example, Carla Clark of the UK Child Poverty Action Group cites the UK's ratification of the UNCRC as the impetus for passing a 2010 bill that established firm goals and strategy to reduce child poverty there. It is shameful that the most economically developed country in the world does not know how to look after its kids. That needs to change, and it starts with passing this resolution. Vote to pass.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes, 55 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Baron.
Okay, so really interesting speech, Mr. Joel. So how did you start it?
I started it by stating the simple constitutional fact that the US will declare this treaty non-self-executing.
No, you started with talking about how this is a resolution or a guide for action.
Yeah.
So how can you then take that as your intro and how you started off an impact to all these very, very tangible things when we have no idea how the political reality is going to be? And you said it yourself, even if this
It's a
does
great question. So the reason that works is because when we make a statement, we draw attention to the problem and create the impetus to create real tangible change.
Thank you. Representative, thank you for your speech. So bouncing off that line of questioning, my first question to you is, I guess, even if we're making a statement but have no intention of following through on it, which you admitted in our speech, how does that not promote complacency?
I would argue that there's no indication that we have no commitment to following through on it. And even at your highest ground, right? Let's say that this Congress has no interest in reducing child poverty. We bring that issue to the front page of the newspaper by passing this resolution.
Thank you.
And we create groundroots activism.
The questioning period is elapsed. That was a speech in affirmation. All negatives.
Privilege.
State your privilege.
Exit chamber.
Granted. That was a speech in affirmation. Negative speakers, please raise your hand in the participants chat. Mr. Gardner, you have the floor as you stand unopposed. I think Representative Gardner is on mute.
Yeah, I was actually like trying to figure out how to unraise my hand because I'm not good with technology, but I figured it out. So once again, whenever y'all are ready. Good, cool. Governments are one of the hardest discussions to have with anyone, from your macroeconomics teacher to even your physics teacher. It seems as if the number one reason there is so much division within not only this country, but countries across the world is because of the mass amounts of prejudice and biases that people have on how the government ought to operate in the face of complex situations. But we need to realize that we were elected for this position for a reason, to view pieces of legislation and decision-making process through a rational, pragmatic approach. It seems as if those on the affirmation fail to emphasize the approach of pragmatism whenever they view today's legislation. Because as Representative Polstick already stated in today's round, it's only a false promise. Fail. First, let's allude to a point that Representative Polstick already touched on, and this is the fact that the UNCRC fails to protect children's rights. Now, I applaud Representative Polstick for speaking about this so early in today's debate, as it is a key issue, but she fails to supply a warrant throughout the entirety of her speech. Allow me to do that for her. The American Society of International Law identifies that whenever the United Nations forms a treaty or any sort of convention, their main form of enforcement comes from the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council, if you didn't already know, is exceptionally prone to using sanctions, specifically towards diplomatic approaches and towards economic approaches, along with a few military approaches. But there's two exponential reasons as to why this is so problematic in today's round. The first reason is because sanctions in almost every single instance are prone to nearly never work. Look to almost every single Middle Eastern country that the United States and other countries have applied sanctions on for their mass amounts of human rights violations, and they have continuously pressed forward. We can see that there's no incentive for any of these countries to commit to the treaty, which is exceptionally problematic. But second is because on part of the treaty, countries that have ratified include countries like Russia and China that are exceptionally prone towards their own children's rights violations, emphasizing that the only thing you do when you pass today's legislation is emphasize that we're going to do something good, but in reality, nothing happens at all. In fact, the reverse effect happens. This brings me to my second point, which is the fact that whenever we pass today's legislation, we only decrease United States legitimacy. This is simply put because the United States will not follow towards the convention. Representative Joel brought up in his speech that the US courts do not need to enforce regulations. And in all honesty, I'm exceptionally surprised that he brought this up as an affirmative speaker, because it's a major reason you look to fail. Because this means that the US is not going to follow the treaty, as there's already some installations in our Constitution that already violate the treaty within itself. Representative Polstick already talked about orphanage, about orphans and the ability to adopt children. This is really, really problematic because it only creates tensions and stigma between nations on the treaty.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 16 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Goes to Representative Martinez.
So you express concern that we do not have to be legally held to enforce this piece of legislation. But don't you
Representative Joel brought that up and he's on your side.
But don't you think that supranational organizations having their law sovereign over ours is really dangerous?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
If UN law is above United States law, isn't that especially dangerous?
Yeah, I would say that that's problematic, but that's another reason you should look to fail, because the only thing that today's legislation does is jeopardize that.
Held to is submitting a report. So how does that hurt our legitimacy?
Okay, but even if we're held to that and we're not following the treaty, that's problematic because we're creating tensions with countries that want us to follow the treaty. That was the entirety of my second point.
Mistakes.
Representative, so you yourself are concerned about our country's public image. If we feel that that image is put in jeopardy, why wouldn't we just enforce this legislation?
We're putting it in jeopardy by enforcing today's legislation
How?
because we're
We're
not going
helping
to follow the
children.
convention, right? We're not going to follow the convention. And this is what
No.
Representative Joel, who's
You
on
said
your
that
side,
if we pass
explained.
this legislation, if we don't enforce it, our image will be in jeopardy. Why wouldn't we just enforce it then?
Our image isn't in jeopardy from not
Thank
signing
you,
on to this
Representative.
convention. It's
Thank you.
The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, Chair is now seeking affirmative speakers to please rise. That speech goes to Representative Liu.
Hello, everyone. My name is Representative Liu again, Liu. Judges, if I could just get a thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you, PO. Are you good? Thank you. In my morning hour, I proudly proclaimed that Congress ought to stand with the child, and nearly 3 hours later, my advocacy still hasn't budged. But between these 3 hours, while I faced a computer and thousands of technical problems, even more children in the United States faced abuse as they tried to stay alive. Senators, it's about time that we realize that children are more than just a property and something that parents can use. Let's face the child for what they really are, a human being, and pass this convention and lead America towards a better future. But first, let's look beyond the details and address how the US is finally going to tackle a large problem with child abuse in the United States and look towards intervening in this harmful cycle. As the National Children's Alliance finds that nearly 700,000 children are abused in the US annually. An estimated 683,000 children were victims of abuse and neglect in 2015, the most recent year for which this is national data. But here's why it's so important. As they continue to identify this cycle, they find that it's a reoccurring issue. About 4 out of 5 abusers are the victim's parents. A parent of the child victim was the perpetrator in 78.1% of substantiated cases of child maltreatment. Of those alleged to have abused children, nearly a quarter of them themselves were children. So let's step in at this moment and find a way to actually solve the problem right at its core. Child abuse is one of the worst problems plaguing the nation right now, far beyond anything that we've ever brought up. And it's time that we actually did something to help these little people that actually do something for us. But next, let's look towards one of the most important points that the negation has brought up today, which is the fact that the convention hasn't actually done anything in the status quo. But understand that's not a reason to fail today, because the United States, as we all know, is a global power that can lead us to actually doing something with a convention. Let's increase our influence internationally, which ideally leads other countries to follow in our pursuit in bettering the lives of millions of children worldwide. As Brookings predicts, the United States not having ratified the CRC remains relatively silent on child protection issues on the international level. Even though the CRC is one of the most ratified conventions, it's also one of the most violated by many states, as stated by Representative Polczyk. However, as the United States and its human rights practices has a big influence on other states, the ratification of the CRC would allow the US to have its word and impact on other states' practices on children's issues and protections of rights. Currently, the United States is being internationally criticized for not having ratified the convention, while it would allow promoting other states to improve their policies on eliminating of children's involvement in military, child labor, slavery, and other issues. As Representative Gardner and Representative Polczyk, this is where your concerns come into play. Like Senator Farage said in direct questioning, why can't we just enforce this piece of legislation as the US and the Congress that we are have the power to do so? I am sitting here at your computer facing every single one of you, but while I am talking, thousands and millions of children are being affected by the US's lack of action. This has to stop now, so let's act today.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 6 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Mr. Wu.
All right, Representative Liu, let's take a specific part of the UNCRC that expressly forbids non-consensual separation of children and parents unless the parents are abusive. You agree that's part of it, right?
Yes, that is.
Okay, so let's take Representative Gardner's example about adoption. Isn't that going to be in violation of the UNCRC?
I'm going to say that adoption happens for multiple factors beyond just having an abusive parent or being born into an orphanage. And I think that we have to remind ourselves that this is a resolution,
Yes.
so we can always build on top of it.
So why is ending child abuse in America unique to ratifying the UNCRC? Like, why don't we just
All right,
pass a bill?
we can definitely pass a bill, but I'm saying, like I said in my second point, it's going to influence international countries to follow in our footsteps. And as we know, children have multiple issues across the country and across the globe. So I think that we can definitely solve this problem as well as having international
Wait,
influence.
but
So it's a
other
win-win
countries
situation.
have already decided they're not going to follow the UNCRC. Is the
Thank
Right,
you,
but like I said-
Representative.
magically going to
The
change
questioning
that?
period is elapsed. Seeing if that was a speech and affirmation, negative speakers, please raise your hand. That goes to Representative Mongolik.
I think
Under
the
personal
chair.
privilege,
State that privilege.
exit the chamber.
Granted.
Thank you.
That's Senator Monglick, and I'll begin with a thumbs up from the judges. Judges are ready? Okay. I will always value practical policy over political posturing. Let me be the first senator in today's round to talk about the concrete harms of today's legislation. Let's cut clear from all of the theoreticals. The problem with today's legislation is that it tries to give a one-size-fits-all solution to the tailored needs of the United States. There is one particular program that will be discontinued under today's ratification, but that cannot be allowed to happen. And that's because today's legislation will end the JROTC, or Junior Reserves Officer Training Corps program, which is going to be extremely detrimental to the children of America. Now, JROTC operates in high schools and middle schools, instilling the technical knowledge, leadership skills, and community service into students who are at high risk. The program was created specifically to help low-income areas. But under the Article 38 of the UNCRC, state parties shall refrain from recruiting anyone younger than 15 into armed services. Now, that leaves a little gray area, but the UN specifically said in a report in 2013 that they would consider JROTC to be in violation of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. The problem is that that text was written to prevent the use of child soldiers, not to prevent an extremely helpful program to uplift our most struggling youth. The University of Washington in March of 2014 explains why JROTC is so effective. With behavioral psychology, children who are in low opportunity areas often want to find order in a life of chaos. They can find that by joining organizations. JROTC operates like a good gang, balancing out the other gangs that will ultimately hurt these children. In fact, the youth that join gangs are 3 times as likely to have drug use issues, half as likely to graduate, and 3 times as likely to be incarcerated. On the other hand, Marshall University in 2014 found that JROTC across the board increases the social development of cadets, increases graduation rates, and overall improves school environments. Essentially, it's a win-win. But today's legislation will steal this valuable opportunity by providing you the single negative on the entire debate of why ratification will concretely hurt America's children. We must negate and look to the other alternative, which is passing children's rights laws that simply involve everything else in the ratification, but allow JROTC to continue. There are literally no harms to this approach, and we still achieve all of the benefits of the affirmative. Now, Senator Martinez tells you about conversion therapy and family separation. Both those topics are incredibly tragic and need to be prevented. But they can be if we pass our own omnibus rights bill that still preserves JROTC and gives opportunity to the most deserving students. It's exceedingly important to have the rights of children. Let's preserve them and preserve opportunity.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 11 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Joel.
Great speech, Representative. So this legislation is a resolution, so it's non-binding, correct?
No, ratification would be binding.
But this isn't a bill to ratify. This is a resolution, correct?
Well, it's a resolution to introduce it for ratification, right?
Okay. But even if it is ratified, we would include a non-self-executing clause, correct?
I don't think we would. That
Or
doesn't
else it
make
would
any
be
sense.
vetoed by the executive.
No, because that would just defeat the whole point of ratifying it. Like that's
No, the
like
point of
outside the scope
ratifying
this
it is to
debate.
make a commitment,
Bar
and then
on.
on subsequent legislation to be passed.
I don't think that's true. Treaties are definitely
Bar
meant to be
on.
legally binding.
All right, cool, thanks. All right, so let's talk about the JROTC. So who does the JROTC like recruit?
Students in need.
Students in need. And so are these often minority students? Are these poor students? What are they?
They often are. And what we can see from the data is that it really improves outcomes.
Right, but it also sends, it basically makes it so that the United States military is now recruiting large amounts of minority students to go and fight their wars. So isn't that kind of like, I don't know.
It's always an individual choice, Representative. And as my studies showed you, it's because JROTC often becomes a choice between joining a gang.
Thank you,
There's a particular
Representative.
student.
Thank you. The questioning period is elapsed.
I thank the chair.
Seeing as that was a speech in negation, the chair is now seeking affirmative speakers to please raise their hand. That speech goes to Representative Mangalek. Excuse me, Representative Farage.
I thank the chair. Once again, that's Representative Farage. It's spelled F-A-R-A-J for all of the judges and everyone else inside the chamber. Can I please have an indication when everyone's ready? Great, I see 2, 3, awesome. Thank you guys so much. Sorry, there we go. South Sudan is less than a decade old. Somalia recently emerged from a deadly civil war. The United States hires high schoolers to represent them in Congress. What do we all have in common? We are the only 3 countries in the entire world who hadn't signed the UNCRC. But as of recent developments, America stands as the only country. At the point where North Korea has literally ratified a human rights treaty and we haven't, we understand that there is a huge problem. This legislation fixes that. Let's clear up the biggest misconception on the negative side. That's something that's brought up by Representative Vyas and Representative Pautsik, who tried to convince us that there is no way for the UN to actually enforce this convention. I actually want to distance myself from Representative Joel on my own side and give you an actual, tangible reason why this convention has global authority. That's because becoming a state party actually implements an international enforcement and forces the United States to comply with this convention. In cross-examination, I asked Representative Pautsik what this legislation does to enforce. She couldn't give me a real reason, but here's why this legislation enforces better than previous conventions. Articles 42 and 44 through 46 of the UNCRC ensure that the state parties cannot avoid the obligation to publicize, report on, and monitor the enforcement and failures of enforcement of all parts of the UNCRC. The United States is finally going to have to face our failures firsthand and begin implementing practical solutions to ensure the protection of the human rights of American youth. Representative Gardner tells us they're concerned about our country's public image. I couldn't agree more. That's why this legislation works. Because as a country so strongly scrutinized by the global media, we are held to the standards of the global community. Representative Pautsik, we will ratify and enforce the provisions of this legislation because of that global scrutiny. But now let's understand what the tangible outcomes of ratifying the UNCRC are. It's not just ending border separation, Representative Martinez, and it's not just decreasing abuse, Representative Liu. One of the biggest reasons, which I'm actually embarrassed that no one else on my side has brought up, is that this legislation actually moves our criminal justice system toward more rehabilitative measures for juveniles. That's because under Article 37 of the UNCRC, cruel punishment, including juvenile life without parole, is completely outlined in the United States. But why is that important? An August 2019 report by the Juvenile Law Center explained that both developmental psychology and neuroscience agree that youth's developmental maturity, particular susceptibility to negative peer influences, and a capacity for change and rehabilitation indicate that youth are the most susceptible to being rehabilitated inside the United States. When we pass this legislation, we move toward that program. Affirm.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes, 3 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Mangalik.
Hi, Senator. You're absolutely right that children should not be locked up without the possibility of parole forever.
Yeah.
What I'm struggling to understand is why wouldn't we just pass a bill that takes all the measures of the UNCRC, but preserves valuable programs like JROTC?
So I think that losing the JROTC is just one small tangible impact of passing this legislation. Let me finish. On the other hand, we're actually increasing the positive aspects inside our country, like reducing border separation and also helping juvenile offenders.
That's not unique from actually just passing a separate measure.
Hey, Representative, so how does this international enforcement actually work?
So essentially, the media internationally always scrutinizes the United States. There's plenty of watchdog organizations that always look out for US actions. Because of that, we are held under that global scrutiny. And because so many UN countries have ratified this treaty,
has the media successfully changed the United States policies in the past?
Yes, the United States is
Why did
very
the Trump administration pull out of the Paris Climate Accords?
It didn't work for the Paris Climate Accords. That's because of differences inside our own government.
The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as though it's a speech and affirmation, native speakers, please raise your hand. That speech goes to Representative Vias.
Perfect. Thank you. For the judges, once again, that's Representative Vias, VYAS. I authored our first piece of legislation, if that helps by any means, but any indication when you're ready, and I will get going. Perfect.
Just to let you all know real quick, I'm just going to mute my video for a second because my partner just got home. So I don't want him walking back and forth to distract you. So I'm still here. I'm still focused solely on you and still judging, but you just won't see me. Okay, so I just wanted to let you know.
No problem. Looks like everyone's ready, so I'll get going. Today, we are discussing the US's refusal to sign on to the UNCRC. But to understand the entire breadth of the problem, it's worth mentioning that the US also hasn't signed on to the Refugee Convention, the Paris Climate Accords, and we adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights almost 40 years after it was introduced. It is clear that the problems that we face in today's debate aren't just about the rights of children, but also about the way in which we go about ratifying these important treaties. That's why I stand in litigation. First, fail today's legislation because we need to reform our ratification process if we actually want to ratify the UNCRC and see the full benefits. The Economist writes in October of 2018 that the bar for treaty ratification is set high in America. Simply, in order to ratify a UN treaty, the president must send treaties to the Senate, where they require approval by a 2/3 majority. The same standard also required to amend the Constitution. So even if passing this resolution miraculously led to the ratification by the Senate, it still wouldn't have an impact unless we reform in the way in which we adopt these treaties. Because the ACLU writes in November of 2015 that in order to protect national sovereignty, America often ratifies human rights pacts with the condition that they will not overrule existing laws. So when Representative Martinez talks about ending family separation, and Representative Joel talks about child poverty, all of these things aren't protected by ratifying the UNCRC, because whenever the UN, or rather the US, ratifies global treaties, they join with reservations. Essentially, by ratifying the UNCRC, the administration currently in charge The Trump administration, the one in charge of family separation, isn't going to say that what they were doing was a violation of international law. That's why this resolution ends up doing nothing. But so far, I've told you why this resolution doesn't do anything, but the affirmation is still wondering what the inherent harm is of passing. That is because today's legislation prevents future progress on the issue. Representative Palcic has done a wonderful job telling us how today's legislation builds complacency by essentially telling the public that we're going to move on with the issue. Let's understand why that happens. CBS News writes in January of 2020 that Congress passes bills and resolutions that are largely symbolic to get the subject of the legislation off their plate. Essentially, by passing today's legislation, we signal to the global community that we're okay, we've taken action on child rights, and then we move on to another issue. We have a very full agenda, like Representative Martinez tells us. We don't have time to continuously go back and forth, redoing the same pieces of legislation. Passing allows us to pat ourselves on the back when the problem is far from solved. That's why I stand in the negation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes, 8 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Martinez.
So I agree with you that we need to initiate better policy for children's rights. But the reason I stand on the affirmation is that we're going to have to submit a report on how we enforce this convention. Why is that such a bad thing?
Right. So the other 192 parties in the UNCRC also support, also send in these reports. And lots of countries haven't seen an increase in child's rights. The report on net doesn't do much.
Well, don't you think that if we, the United States, signs this convention, others will want to respect it?
Far on.
I didn't mean to I meant to lower my hand from the call. My bad.
Then that next question will go to Representative Liu.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Representative, great speech. So I'm just wondering, haven't I already proven that the United States has enough influence globally to actually change this course of action that the convention has taken in the past few years?
Yes, in general, the United States, if we want to do something, we will. It is obvious that we don't necessarily want to sign this treaty, right? The Trump administration is champion of family separation. This same administration isn't going to go
but does President Trump have the totalitarian power, or do we as Congress have the power to overrule?
Thank you. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as that was a speech in negation, affirmative speakers, please raise your hand. And if they were up from before, make sure to take them down. That goes to Representative Saxena.
Unmute myself. Okay. And as always, I'm at the leisure of all those above me. So if you could just give me any indication when you're ready. Just making sure we have everyone. Okay, great. Right. As a Congress, we didn't come here to fear the future, but we came here to write it. Our children are our future, and yet we're too scared to write the future of our children in a positive light. Let's look at the framework that's been established for this round and see why your vote will fall in the affirmation. The principal argument of the affirmation is that America needs better protections for its children. Essentially, international oversight will only make us better. The negation's fundamental argument is that no change will happen because of a lack of an enforcement mechanism. Innately, both sides agree that a change in policy does have to occur. The question is just about whether or not this resolution is how we fix it. So first, let's look at what the negation's primary arguments are. First, the negation continues to use the UNCRC's lack of an enforcement mechanism as a scapegoat for policy failures, and they continue to contradict themselves. Representative Palcic and Mingalik say adoption and JROTC will end under will end under UNRC, but then Representative Politics says that it's just going to be a guise for inaction because we won't follow the rules. Let's make up our mind. Are we going to follow the rules or are we not going to? Once again, UN law is still not sovereign over US law. Michigan State International Review in 2014 said that the committee responds to state reports only with observations and recommendations that are not binding, and rather function as their name suggests, to recommend areas for improvement. We are going to preserve our sovereignty. If we want to preserve US-specific programs, we still can. But next, Representative Gardner and Politics still tell us that it's going to be a guise for inaction. I am telling you it doesn't have to be. If we want to change the status quo, this is the House of Representatives. Let's do it. The effectiveness of the UNCRC has come into question this entire round, but let's see why it's actually very effective. The UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health explains in 2014, since UNCRC has been passed, the mortality rate has been halved. We've increased the number of children attending primary school. 90% of the countries that have made the promise to make primary schools free and compulsory have done so, and we've seen increases in attendance, and that's because of global scrutiny. We open ourselves up to get international recommendations. So Representative Bias, when you say we'll just move on, how about this? Let's not. So even if we don't want to do our job, let's look at the impact that's guaranteed to happen, and that's when we increase US legitimacy. According to The Economist in October of 2013, ratifying the Child Rights Treaty could also improve America's reputation as a champion of children's well-being. It's awkward when the US tries to promote children's rights in other countries. They all remind us they've joined the treaty and we have not. This could help us in kickstarting human rights initiatives around the globe. This is the concrete impact that will happen. So Representative Paulson, if you're concerned about credibility, we have more credibility if we sign this treaty than if we don't. We are literally the only country in the entire world that has not. We open ourselves up to have more influence. Line 24 of this resolution reads that the US should use its voice, vote, and influence to advance and support the aims of the UNCRC. Every representative in this chamber already has a voice, a vote, and an influence. Let's use it.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. Ms. Palcic.
Thank you. Representative, great speech. So my question to you is, why should we sign on to something that you yourself admit probably won't be enforced when, as members of the UN, the United States can pass other legislation that will not harm perhaps orphans in war-torn nations and meet all the criterion we think should be passed?
All right, so what the UCLA's Fielding School of Medicine said was that in countries that actually did pass this, they were complying with the treaty. The reason for that is because of international recommendations. Well, sorry?
North Korea signature, they're not complying. China is a signature, they're not complying.
We have the
Mangalik.
Hi, Senator. I'm a little hurt. It feels like you dropped me off the flow. When we already have programs that we need to preserve that are going to be hurt by the ratification of the UNCRC, why wouldn't we just pass those rights?
Like the Michigan State International Review has once again said that we still have ultimate sovereignty. The UN
there's going to be legal
law sovereignty. If we want to continue the JROTC, we can.
Right, but Senator, we're still going to have a contradiction between having international law
Thank
that
you,
goes against
Representative.
policy.
Thank you. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as there was a speech in affirmation, Chair is now seeking speeches in negation to raise their hand at this time. That goes to Representative Wu.
I thank the chair. This is Representative Wu, still in a snow-filled Illinois, unfortunately. Any indication when you guys are ready would be wonderful. And Mr. Gray, are you ready? Wonderful. Today's debate has run down to one major question: whether or not today's legislation is going to influence the United States. Let me make this very, very clear. Not only are we not going to change US policy, but on top of that, we are actually going to roll back some of the things that the UNCRC has been able to accomplish. So let's understand why, A, the United States is not going to change. For this, I turn to Elizabeth Welling on April 11, 2018, where she states that traditionally the conservative political and moral ideology involves a significant influence on a family structure free from government interference. But when we affirm today's piece of legislation, or when we affirm the UNCRC, we actually oppose this ideology. Sorry. An example is that the document itself states that the child shall have the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds through any media of the child's choice, something that conservatives don't like, and this opposes conservative ideology. So then we aren't going to pass today's piece of legislation in the Senate. But then let's look at what else can happen. Even if we do affirm today's piece of legislation, as Representative Vias points out, we will still not adopt every single part of the UNCRC. And so we won't show the commitment that Representative Joel advocates for. But then let's look at how today's legislation ends up harming the international law. Because Ingrid Worth of Lawfare on April 10th, 2017, points out that non-compliance with human rights treaties will make the rest of the international law less effective. This is known as the broken windows theory of international law. And to explain this to everybody, let's actually look at a real example. A study done by Roger Alford of the Notre Dame Law School detailed case studies of 7 countries in Latin America that showed this effect. Essentially, when the government of 2 countries began illicit healthcare practices in violation of international law, several surrounding countries soon followed out. So when we affirm today's piece of legislation, we aren't going to be following the UNCRC, and we give a blank check to every single other country to not follow the UNCRC as well. That's something that I'm not willing to stand for. That's why we need to stand on the negation of today's legislation. Representative Liu stated that she wanted to make the UNCRC stronger for everybody else, but in the end, we're only doing one thing. We're making everything worse. We're dragging everyone down when we affirm the UNCRC, and that's why we negate today's piece of legislation and we continue with the status quo so we don't harm children any further.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes, 51 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. That goes to Representative Saxena.
Hi, Representative. Great speech. Just I'm a little confused. Could you explain how we are dragging everyone down if we're the only ones that haven't signed the treaty?
Yes, because once we sign this treaty, the assumption is that we're going to follow this international law. When we aren't following the international law,
how about this? Instead of us not following international law, why don't we just follow international law once we've ratified the treaty and uphold our commitment? Like, why are
because that's not going to occur. I pointed out how conservatives are not going.
Hi, Senator. So can you tell me under what circumstances would the United States intervene in a family's life?
Well, we see that right now with adoptions, if a child is being abused, we intervene.
Right, so that's child abuse. Why would we want to refuse?
Please let me finish. Yeah. We also see this administration being perfectly fine with violating international law when they strip children from immigrant families.
Okay, but why would the U.S. refrain from interfering if it's child abuse?
Thank you, Representative. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as there was a speech in the affirmation, negative speakers, please raise your hand at this time. I think Mr. Baron is the only one trying to raise their hand, so that goes to Representative Baron. And seeing as all of the legislators have spoken, this will be the last speech of the round.
So we're all good? Perfect. Perfect. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I'm making us stay a little over time. I'm sorry I'm the second egg in the row. But that just shows how much I believe in my side. I think that the affirmation has the very best of intentions, and I want to work with them as best as I possibly can to ensure children's rights in the future. But because today's legislation does so much more harm than good, we need to fail. So the affirmation talks about issues that affect children in the wrong manner. For example, Ms. Martinez talks about conversion therapy, Ms. Faraj talks about criminal justice, and others have mentioned childhood poverty. Now, we have shown that we have the ability to abide by specific treaties, as mentioned in the third whereas clause. We need to address each of these issues separately and then we can advance the agenda, Ms. Saxena. However, this block resolution does us so much harm. A key area is in parental rights. So first, we're going to fail today's legislation because the UNCRC has historically threatened a parent's rights to homeschool their children. And that's because of Article 29, and associated passages of the UNRC, which when implemented have led to invasive policies designed to take away rights from parents. Now, Ms. Martinez has already mentioned how we're moving away from the parents, and I agree with her, conversion therapy is atrocious, but this has other negative detriments. According to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, November of 2015, the UNCRC mandates that government assessors seek the opinion of the child over the parent. So children, regardless of their lack of knowledge of their family's finances and opinions, take precedent. Now, a child's education should be exclusively up to the president. Our Supreme Court established this in 1971 with Wisconsin versus Yoder, and the UN even agrees. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they've said that the right to decide the kind of education that shall be given to their children is up to the parent. But let's take the affirmation at their highest ground and say that this does change the status quo. So, Mr. Joel, you talked about possible legislations that we can implement, and so let's look at past precedent. So, if we pass this resolution, looking to countries like England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, Article 29 forces local government to, at worst, collect private data about homeschooled children and their families to create a national database, or at best, approve a curriculum to ensure they meet state regulations. But this is so harmful because according to this Culver Education Institute in January of 2018, children with learning disabilities or physical handicaps do not thrive in public schools. As a result, parents take them out of these schools and try and teach them at home using specialized curriculums that are developed by universities and NGOs. But when we pass today's legislation, what's going to happen is that now state mandated education curriculums take precedent, which is going to hurt these children. With over 2 million disabled children in the education system, we cannot allow this to happen. We need to stand up for those who cannot speak for themselves. That's why I completely agree with you, Ms. Saxena. Now, Ms. Faraj is telling us that everything is going to be enforced, but that's not a good thing. We can't hurt so many of our most vulnerable constituents. And she says that the media is going to regulate us. I didn't know our current administration cared so much about the media. Now, kids aren't homeschooled to be taught creationism or intolerance. They're taught because that's what their parents feel is best for them. Respect that right and fail today's legislation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes, 6 seconds. Questioners, please raise your hand. I'll go to Faraj.
Hi, Representative. So the UNCRC states in that provision that education should develop a child's skills to their best standard. How does that actually challenge homeschooling?
Right. So as I said, I took actually Mr. Joel's framework when he said that we're going to look to other countries. Like he said, we're going to look to China in their 2010. So what I did is I looked to other countries because we don't know how Article 29.
Okay, yeah. So we're not looking to other countries because we're enforcing.
No,
it
we are. That's what your own side said.
Can I ask you a question? So
Yeah,
inside the United States, that provision only applies.
All right. So what's the legal standard in the United States when we make decisions concerning children?
We defer to the parent.
No, we do. It's in the best interest of the child. So considering the fact UN law is not sovereign over our own law, what's stopping us from making decisions in the best interest of the child if it includes homeschooling as well?
Right, but like under that framework, we can say that like all of this is moot because you're telling me that because it doesn't agree with US law, like that doesn't matter. But then that means that none of the other things that you're proposing are going to be in effect.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you. The questioning period is elapsed. Seeing as all people have spoken, the chair will now entertain a motion to call for orders of the day. Representative Faraj.
I move to previous question.
Second.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed? We'll now move to previous question and utilize the voting feature. Yes or no if you're in favor of passing item 2C, a bill to require parental consent to protect minors on social media. Please do the green check mark.
The UN Convention.
The UN Convention on the Right of the Child. excuse me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the negation. This legislation fails after dozens of technical difficulties, 46 questions, and 22 speeches. This legislative session is hereby adjourned.
Thank you all for judging and presiding and everything.
Thank you for
Thank you,
judging.
judges.
Thank you, Carly.
Good round, guys. Good round.
And that was Jackson Winder as your presiding officer. Thank you so much for judging.
Okay, so our session tomorrow is going to start at 11. Please get here in advance, maybe like 20 minutes before that, so we can like make sure that everyone is here and everything is running smoothly.
Sounds
Thanks.
good.
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.